The leader began to ask Jinwoo if he knew their true purpose. He immediately replied that they were Graveguard. If he was a normal dungeon boss, it wouldn't raise any questions. However, if you encounter a two-headed ogre at the entrance, it can only mean one thing: the undead dwell here. As soon as they remembered them, they immediately appeared, and all the hunters began to worry and ask the leader what they should do. Should they attack or should they not? But all of a sudden, they started to behave strangely, and they stopped. However, the hunters didn't understand what was happening to them and why they ran away as soon as they saw them, because usually a live one would attack people. Maybe they were scared of something, but Jin-Woo, who was standing behind them, reflected that he didn't expect this when he walked here. Suddenly, Jin-Woo felt some strange feeling. At this moment, Jin-Woo began to tell the hunters that he needed to leave, as he had urgent matters to attend to, but the leaders didn't understand what he was talking about and started saying that without him, their team might die. He should have realized it himself. But Jin-Woo replied that he knew about it and would now call his friend, whom they could also rely on, and handle it himself. However, the leader still couldn't understand what he was talking about, and as soon as he saw that Jin-Woo had summoned his general ant, they didn't realize that it was the same ant from the island. Jin-Woo went on to say that it seemed like everyone was already aware of it and wouldn't have to waste time explaining. He replaced himself and began to tell his general to protect the people, and anyone who doesn't belong to the people can do as they please. After these words, General Ant began to shout for joy, as he was very happy that he could have some fun. The hunters who were standing nearby realized that they would now go with him. The girl standing next to him called her comrade Mr. Jin-Woo. Eventually, a backup consisting of many ants appeared. There were about 20 of them. But the leaders behind and the healer girl standing next to him still tried to stop Jin-Woo, saying that he had just summoned a bunch of monsters for nothing. Jin-Woo turned around with a serious face and started telling them that if they wanted, he could call them back, but it was better than nothing. After such a serious matter, they could no longer say anything and only agreed. Jin-Woo, who was standing in this queue, looked at how much more time was left to recover the skill. There was still 1 hour and 42 minutes left, and he didn't understand why it happened at this particular moment. Jin-Woo started running towards the exit of this dungeon with all his speed. He ran at full speed and realized that the signals from the soldiers he had attracted to his sister did not stop, and he had a bad feeling. Suddenly, he saw many soldiers of the undead army in front of him and started shouting to tell them to stay out of his way. Suddenly, all the undead began to kneel down and worship him. Jin-Woo didn't realize what was happening after all. They were worshiping him because he specialized in necromancy. But right now, he didn't have time to think about it, so he summoned his dragon, Kaisel, who soared under his feet. And as soon as Jin-Woo got out of the dungeon, at that very moment, he started flying his dragon towards his sister. Everyone on this side of the portal watched in surprise as Hunter Jin-Woo was heading somewhere on his dragon. Jin-Woo started telling him to fly with all his power towards his sister and to fly even faster. He applied a skill that is used on all shadow soldiers, and the skill level of each shadow soldier increased by 50%. The orcs that were guarding Jin-Woo's sister were destroying the other orcs that had pounced on them. The battle was very vivid, but the green orcs were defeated. The disciples who were watching this with amazement saw the ferocious Shadow Supreme orcs killing the ordinary orcs, and in the end, the latter were defeated. The disciples realized that these monsters were protecting one of the female disciples, and they were now on their side. Jin-Woo's sister stood behind one of the orcs and asked if her brother had already come and was here. But one of the orcs stopped her and pointed his thumb at the window, thus saying that he would arrive here soon. At this time, the last barrier that was inside broke, and one of the orcs sitting on the throne began to listen to one of his servants, who was telling him that now Groctar, the leader of the Red Knife tribe, no one would be able to interfere. But another orc turned to Groctar and said that the orcs were helping the humans, and there were 3 of them here, and they were at the school. Groctar began to get angry, for warriors from the most powerful clan were a weakness, and he decided that he would have to deal with them himself. He took his big axe and went to them, for it was time for a massacre. A little while later, the ants that stayed in the other dungeon and fought for the humans were screaming loudly as they killed their opponents. The hunters who were watching all this were thinking about whether they should leave. After all, they were afraid to imagine what would happen if the ants suddenly pounced on them. But the leader of the mountain realized that right now they couldn't stop the raid, and even if they could, The reporters wouldn't leave them so easily. And even though some hunters are afraid of them, they can't do that. They need to finish the raid. But suddenly, Ant Bear appeared near the leader and thus scared her. However, as soon as the leader wanted to say something, the ant disappeared and at the same moment appeared at the same place where he was standing with great speed, rushed away. Ewat had already thrown his paws and threw something on the ground at the feet of the leader. After a second, the leader, sitting on the ground, saw a large ant in front of him. It looked at him, turned around, and started walking away with its army of ants in the other direction. The hunters who ran up to him started asking if everything was okay and what they should do. Follow them or stay here. But the leader replied that everything was fine. As soon as they lowered their heads, they saw the head of the Death Knight lying at their feet. They were surprised because that ant had slain a top-level monster with one swing, and they couldn't believe how strong he was. Suddenly, the leader realized and started smiling. After all, no one knows how much top-tier crystals are worth. If that's the case, yet they couldn't leave right now. As soon as the leader looked up, he saw that all the hunters started to go straight for the ants. But at this time, a new battle was brewing between the orcs at the school, and the orc Groctar showed up to place himself behind his comrades and his war orcs. He stood behind them and began to all shout Groctar together. Groctar began to say that his orc tattoos symbolized the number of victories and showed how many enemies had fallen at his hands. Looking at his opponents, he realized that they had inflicted quite a few kills as well. However, that was all they were capable of, and he began to swing his large sword, telling the higher orcs to have fun with it while he was here having fun with them. But just as he swung his great sword, another orc parried his blow. But that didn't stop him, and Groctar put even more effort into it, slicing the shadow orc in half. However, he suddenly saw the shadow orc recover and realized that it was magic. No matter how many blows he threw, it was all useless. He thought about the fact that he could kill and wanted to kill 100, wanted to kill 1,000 times. But suddenly, this orc started to feel some voices in his head. There were voices in his head that were urging him to kill all humans. He began to realize that each time, the voice in his head was getting stronger, and he needed to finish off these orcs as soon as possible. He realized that if he could control them with magic, he needed to destroy the caster. He realized that behind all of this was the girl who was hiding among her servants so that they could capture her as soon as possible, as she was weakened. If the orcs are constantly regenerating, they must all attack the orcs before they have time to regenerate, and thus capture the girl quickly. But the last shadow orc that was left was able to grab the other two orcs, and Jinwoo's sister was left unprotected. At this moment, a separate orc appeared, grabbed her head, and began to say that he always knew it was her, for he could clearly feel her magic. Just as he decided to finish her off, he began to feel something approaching in the distance, and his hands began to shake. With that, he was able to let go of Jinwoo's sister, and she fell to the ground. But the orc, who was watching with his gut, felt something approaching him, something terrible, and it made him shake with fear. And suddenly, the leader of the Groctar began to tell his servants to get down as soon as possible. And at that moment, an explosion sounded in the room, and someone burst into the room, raising a large dust, causing all the disciples to start coughing. It was Jin-Woo, who had managed to arrive in time after all. He put his hand on his sister's head and started telling her that everything was fine now, and she was safe. All the orcs started to back away, and Groctar saw a large dragon in front of him and a strange hunter with terrifying power coming from him. He started to tell him that he was Groctar of the Red Knives, but before he could finish, Jinwoo turned to him and pointed his index finger at him, telling him to shut up and wait. Then he hugged his sister and started to say that she was safe and apologized for being late. At that moment, he turned to the other students and asked if they were okay, and he heard that they were fine. Sonia, who was standing next to him, said she was fine. But suddenly, she noticed a frightening aura coming from Jinwoo. Then suddenly he noticed that his sister had a red mark on her face because that orc had grabbed her with his big hand and lifted her into the air. At that moment, he got very angry and called his shadow commander, Igris, and ordered him to take care of his sister. And the soldiers who were also summoned had to get the children out of the school. The orcs who were standing nearby began to cower in fear, and suddenly they moved, and Jinwoo sensed it and started telling them that he had ordered them to stand still and wait their turn. While all the students were slowly leaving the school on the dragon that was standing below, one of the orcs started to say that he was controlling those warriors and asked who he was and how he knew their language. But that orc only saw in front of him an enraged hunter who could barely contain his incredible strength from destroying them in 1 second. And he realized that he wasn't going to get an answer. They all started pouncing on him together, but Jinwoo stood still and waited for them to run closer and closer. As soon as one of the orcs swung at him, Jinwoo grabbed him by 2 fingers and he started screaming at the top of his voice in incredible pain. Not even a few seconds later, that orc was already slumped on the ground, stomping his feet into the rocks that were flying from his large body. But Jinwoo didn't take long and finished him off with a single kick of his foot. At the same time, the remaining 2 orcs, despite the death of their comrade in arms, rushed to flee. However, Jinwoo used his ruler hand skill, and the 2 orcs began to rise into the air. When he squeezed his hand, both orcs turned into a pile of meat. After that, the entire pack of orcs that were in the room started screaming furiously and running towards the hunter, but he didn't want to just stand there and wait, so he used his bare hands to pierce through their bodies. In a few seconds, they were all down. Only their leader remained, who stood in the corner and shook, for he did not understand how this was possible. As soon as he wanted to say something, Jinwoo's hand grabbed his head and pushed him against the wall. Jinwoo, while holding him near the wall, noticed that the corridor where the orc came from had a lot of students lying on the ground and bleeding. He turned the other way and saw the same thing from another corridor. He started to ask, why are they killing people like that? The orc began to answer, as if hearing voices in his head of people wanting to kill him. Jinwoo started saying, what about me? Do you want to kill me too? But in response, the orc just started to beg, asking him to spare him. Jinwoo asked again, looking at him, and the orc began to cry, with tears streaming down his face. The hunter realized that to them, he wasn't human at all. At that moment, his blade began to appear in his other hand, and finally Jinwoo began to say that it didn't matter anymore, and he would spare him. However, he shouldn't expect to enjoy this process. At this time, in that big gate where there were many hunters from the Night Guild, one of the healers started tugging on her colleague's clothes, saying that at least he should understand how much it costs. But the ant general didn't listen to her and started devouring the monsters in the dungeon. She began to say that vampire soul crystals are very expensive. Just as she twitched, the ant accidentally hurt her. She raised her head and saw that the ant had started devouring that vampire anyway. This was noticed by the general ant, who ran up to the healer, extended his large paw, and began healing her wounds. In 1 second, she didn't even have a scratch. She thanked him and realized that it was healing magic, and she couldn't understand why his healing skills were better than hers. After all, he was an ordinary shadow monster, and Ant was a general with his army of ants. They went in a particular direction, and at the end of the corridor, they came across a door that started to open. Behind the door was already the boss of this dungeon, who was eager to kill them. Once all the hunters saw the horrible boss and his horrible guards, they were shocked. The boss of this dungeon turned out to be an archmage. The archmage was considered the most dangerous among all the bosses in the dungeon, and no guild had ever been able to destroy it. However, thanks to a high-level hunter, this incident did not turn into a disaster of great magnitude. Now they were faced with the task of facing the undead army approaching from behind. The leader began shouting for them to close the doors as soon as possible, as those that hadn't been eaten by the ants had come back to life and were ready to attack. The mage girl activated her sacred defense skill, but the leader realized they were trapped, and without Hunter Jinwoo, it would be hard to survive. The healer girl shouted to the leader that her sacred defense would only last 5 minutes, no more. Suddenly, the leader heard some shouting and turned in that direction. He saw the ant general approaching the boss. The boss of this dungeon, speaking in human language, began to say that he couldn't believe his eyes. He wondered why the king's troops were fighting against them, since the king himself had chosen them. The undead army was confused, as was the boss of the dungeon, who couldn't believe what he was seeing, for it was impossible. He planned to report to the king, but the ant general didn't wait long and jumped up to the boss, hitting him with all his might. From the blow, the boss began to fly aside, and the ant ended the conversation with, "For someone who's about to die, you talk too much." After a hard blow, the Lord Earth ant started to fly off to the side, but at that moment the ant began to pull his heart out of his chest, and since he had immense strength, he easily ripped out his heart. All of the dungeon boss's servants began to fall as their lives were no longer supported by any dark energy. The hunters who saw this realized that he had dealt with the dungeon boss and the undead army in one blow. They didn't understand how he managed it. The leader, looking at the ant that was eating the boss, shouted that he knew he was possessed but didn't realize he was this strong. Another hunter approached the raid leader, beginning to tell him that with such an arsenal, Shadow Hunter Jinwoo didn't even need to do anything. His warriors could clear any dungeon by themselves. Reflecting on this, he observed that a soldier didn't necessarily need to spend all his mana on summoning, but only half of it. Based on this fight, he mused that many gameplay approaches and items might not even be useful. Suddenly, one of the hunters suggested to their leader that they forget about the original plan and join the Jinwoo Hunter Guild. The leader replied with disgust, saying, "That's nasty. He doesn't even know what to say." After all, merging with another guild, a fine guild founded by a top hunter and the Knights Guild, which is in the top 5 of the strongest guilds in the country, pulling off such a deal, the other hunter began to reply that he was just kidding and didn't think they could pull it off. After all, judging from Hunter Jin-Woo's reaction today, it seemed like he didn't need them. But the leader didn't like it and started telling his comrade that, according to him, since he had become an S-rank hunter, the law didn't apply to him. His comrade apologized, but the leader still said that if he could clear entire dungeons with his soldiers, then the rules should be the same for everyone. And to start a raid, a group of several people must be gathered, including the hunter himself, to comply with regulations, as everyone knows. But his comrades started saying that it's a good idea and that they could provide him with men and lead them with his power, making it a win-win. The leader thought the same way and realized that if they really did this, what would others think of them? Suddenly, the idea came to them that they could say it was just support, that they simply wanted to support him. At this time, it was raining heavily outside. After this incident at the school, all the parents started gathering near the entrance of the school, wanting to personally check what had happened because their children were inside. Some mourned for those being carried out on stretchers. At that moment, Jinwoo was riding in the car with the president of the association, who began to tell him that the 213 students who escaped at the beginning of the incident were now safe and 10 students had been safely rescued. He added that if they had reacted immediately, it might have been avoided. The president handed his phone to Jinwoo, showing that over the past 6 months, the village had seen an increase in new dungeons appearing, and the global statistics showed the number of new ones was growing exponentially, but that wasn't the strangest thing. More and more people wanted to know the level of their awakened abilities, and the number of hunters able to resist the strongest monsters was also growing. It seemed as if some system was trying to balance everything out. Jinwoo realized that something was changing in their world, and began asking the president about Japan, America, China, France, England, Germany, and even distant Central Asia. The president explained that some countries wished to officially make contact with him, and he was sure that some had done so unofficially. The president told him the association had no right to stop these contacts and was merely protecting information about him. Of course, he understood that everything depended on Jinwoo's decision, but he feared that if Jinwoo wanted to leave the country now, it would be difficult for him to adapt. After a long conversation, they soon arrived at the hospital where Jinwoo's sister was. As soon as Jinwoo started to get out of the car, the president of the association told him they would try to provide him with everything he needed. He then asked if Jinwoo couldn't officially stay in South Korea, integrating into their country. There were 10 registered hunters, and 3 were already lost to the association, with 2 having died at the hands of monsters in America. He pleaded for Jinwoo to at least this time play a part in their shared fate. At the end, the president asked Jinwoo what he ultimately wanted. Jinwoo replied that if that were the case, he would allow him to enter the dungeon at the top of the mountain alone. The association president started to confirm if he understood correctly, that Jinwoo wanted him to remove the restriction on the minimum number of people in the group. Jinwoo replied that this was correct. The president began explaining that this restriction was made to keep hunters a little safer because during the raid, each of them risked losing their lives. Yet Jinwoo still insisted. The president then realized that the reason Jinwoo created the guild was to clear the dungeon himself. Jinwoo asked if the association would be willing to fulfill his request. The president, recognizing that Jinwoo was a one-man army, replied that it was difficult but not impossible, and he would do his best. At that moment, one of the videographers started telling the reporter that she did a great job. She thanked him, and just then, her phone rang. It was her brother asking if she wanted to join their guild instead of sitting in their father's guild department out of sight. She was puzzled about why he suddenly brought it up. Her brother, Jin-Ho, then asked if she knew that Jinwoo was returning to Korea. She replied that she knew, although she was more concerned about needing one more person to form a full guild. She teased Jin-Ho, asking if he was trying to lure her into a guild that wasn't even registered yet, and whether he'd gotten involved with some strange type trying to scam him. Jin-Ho responded that if she knew who this strange type was, she'd be surprised.